The sun rises over America's heartland, painting the fields in gold. From behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, watching the landscape unfold at 65 miles per hour, it looks peaceful out here. Beautiful, even. The kind of beautiful that ends up on postcards and in campaign ads about America's backbone. You've driven these roads 10,000 times. Interstate 80 through Nebraska, where the corn stretches to the horizon. Highway 50 through Kansas, the loneliest road they call it, though it's never lonely when you're hauling freight. Route 20 through Iowa, cutting straight through the fertile heart of the nation. You drive past silos that rise like monuments to a way of life, past tractors sitting in fields, their diesel engines rumbling as they pull plows through rich black earth that's been worked for generations, past red barns with white trim, the kind artists paint, the kind tourists photograph, past farmhouses with porch swings and wind chimes, smoke curling from chimneys on cold mornings, laundry hanging on lines that stretch between fence posts weathered gray by sun and time. From your perch in the cab 8 feet off the ground, rolling past at highway speed, you might think everything is just fine out here in farm country. You might think this is still the America your grandparents knew, where hard work meant something, where families could make a living off the land, where neighbors helped neighbors and a handshake sealed a deal. But pull over at the next truck stop. Get out, stretch your legs, breathe in that smell of diesel and coffee and rain on hot asphalt. Walk into the fields. Sit down in the diner booths where the farmers eat breakfast before dawn. Listen to the conversations at the feed store, at the grain elevator, at the livestock auction. Talk to the people who actually work this land, and you'll hear a different story, a darker one that doesn't make it into those postcards or campaign ads. You'll hear about debt that can't be paid, equipment that costs more than a house, seed prices that double in a decade, grain prices that haven't kept pace with inflation since the 1970s. You'll hear about margins so thin that a bad harvest doesn't just mean a rough year. It means losing everything. You'll hear about families who have worked the same land for 5 generations watching that land go up for auction, sold off piece by piece to pay creditors who don't know dirt from dishwater. This is the story nobody wants to tell you about American farming. 100 facts, each one harder than the last. Each one a piece of the puzzle that, when you put them all together, reveals something that should terrify anyone who eats food. This isn't about nostalgia or sentimentality or the way things used to be. This is about the truth of what's happening right now today on the land that feeds us all. This is about the real cost of the food on your table. This is about the human beings who grow that food and what's being done to them. As a truck driver, you haul a lot of things. Steel from Pennsylvania, electronics from California, furniture from North Carolina. But some of your best runs are agricultural. Grain from the Midwest to port cities, produce from California to distribution centers back east, livestock feed from the Plains states to factory farms in the Carolinas and Arkansas. You've seen the whole system from the inside, from the perspective of someone who moves between the pieces, who sees how it all connects. And what you've seen isn't pretty. It's a system that's eating itself alive. A system that's grinding down the very people it depends on. A system built on extraction and exploitation, where a handful of corporations profit enormously, while the people doing the actual work can barely survive. Let's start with the money, because that's where so many of these stories begin. Money, or the lack of it. Debt that compounds like cancer. Expenses that rise faster than any revenue. The slow financial strangulation of American farmers. Fact 1. American farmers are drowning in debt. Farm sector debt is expected to reach $561.8 billion in 2025, up nearly 4% from the previous year. That's the highest level of farm debt ever recorded in the history of American agriculture. To put that number in perspective, it's more than the entire GDP of Sweden. It's more debt than the entire combined debt of all U.S. consumers' auto loans. and it's sitting on the shoulders of just 2 million farm operations. Picture a farmer in Iowa. Let's call him Tom, though his name could be Jim or Sarah or Miguel or any of thousands of others facing the exact same situation. Tom's family has farmed the same 1,200 acres since his great-grandfather broke the prairie with a team of horses in 1883. The land is paid off, passed down through generations, but everything else requires debt. The combine harvester that cuts his corn and soybeans cost $485,000 new. The tractor, $350,000. The planter, $175,000. The sprayer, $380,000. Just those 4 pieces of equipment represent over $13 million in machinery. And that's before you count the grain bins, the trucks, the tillage equipment, the shop tools, and everything else required to run a modern farm operation. Tom didn't buy all that equipment at once, of course. But over 20 years of farming, equipment needs replacement. Technology changes. GPS guidance systems, precision agriculture, variable rate seeding. If you don't keep up, you can't compete. So Tom has financed each purchase through the bank and the equipment dealers, spreading payments over 5 to 7 years at interest rates that have climbed from 3% to over 7% in just 3 years. His annual equipment payments alone run $180,000. Add in operating loans for seed, fertilizer, and chemicals, another $200,000 that he won't repay until after harvest. Add in the mortgage he took out to buy an additional 400 acres when his neighbor retired, another $80,000 a year. Tom is paying over $460,000 in debt service every single year. Before he plants a single seed, before he makes a single dollar in revenue, he's already nearly $500,000 in the hole. And Tom is not unusual. He's typical. Across the Midwest, across the Great Plains, down through the South, farmers face similar numbers. The debt has become structural, inescapable, a constant weight that makes every harvest a referendum on survival. Fact 2. Since 2013, America's farmers have seen their net farm income drop by 45%. That's not a typo, not a misplaced decimal point, not an exaggeration. Nearly half their income gone, evaporated, disappeared. It's the largest 3-year drop in farm income since the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl, an economic catastrophe, drove 2.5 million people off farms and into cities, creating the largest internal migration in American history. But this time there's no Dust Bowl. The technology is better. The yields are higher. Farmers are producing more than ever before, and yet they're earning far less. In 2013, American farmers collectively earned around $120 billion in net farm income. By 2016, that had dropped to around $65 billion. In 2025, farm income hovers barely above that crisis level, supported only by unprecedented government intervention. Without subsidies and insurance payments, the real net farm income from actual agricultural production is even lower. The efficiency gains, the technological improvements, the record harvests, none of it has translated into better financial outcomes for farmers. Instead, all those gains have been captured by the corporations that sell inputs and buy outputs, squeezing farmers from both sides. Fact 3. Without government aid and insurance payments, many farms would have already failed. In recent years, around 40% of total farm income comes from federal aid and insurance, not from selling crops or livestock. 40%. Nearly half of farmer income comes from government programs, not from markets. The farm economy has become dependent on subsidies to an extent that makes a mockery of any discussion about free markets in agriculture. Think about what that means. It means that if you're a corn and soybean farmer, roughly 40 cents of every dollar you make comes not from selling your crops but from government crop insurance payments, subsidies, and disaster assistance. It means the market alone cannot sustain American agriculture. The prices paid for commodities are so far below the cost of production that, without government intervention, farm after farm would collapse. This dependency didn't happen by accident. It's the result of policy choices made over decades. When the government eliminated price floors and supply management in the 1970s and 80s, when they pushed farmers to get big or get out and produce as much as possible, when they allowed consolidation in seed, chemical, equipment, and processing industries, they created a system where farmers have no market power. They take whatever price is offered, and that price, increasingly, is below the cost of production. So the government steps in with subsidies to make up the difference, but those subsidies also enable the corporations to keep paying farmers less, knowing the government will backstop the losses. Fact 4. Farm bankruptcies have been climbing steadily. Between July 2018 and June 2019, Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies increased 12% in the Midwest and 50% in the Northwest. 50% in a single year. In the Northwest, 1 out of every 2 additional farm families faced financial collapse serious enough to require bankruptcy protection. And those are just the official bankruptcies. Thousands more farmers simply stopped farming, knowing that bankruptcy wouldn't save them, that reorganization wouldn't help when the underlying economics are impossible. Chapter 12, bankruptcy, is specifically designed for family farmers. It allows them to restructure debt while continuing to operate, giving them a chance to recover. But what happens when even bankruptcy can't fix the problem? What happens when your debt exceeds the value of your assets? When your operating expenses exceed your revenue year after year? When there's no path back to profitability, no matter how you restructure? Some farmers walk away before filing. They liquidate everything, sell the equipment, lease out the land, find jobs in town. The farm that's been in their family for generations ends not with a bang but with a quiet surrender. No news coverage, no bankruptcy filing, just another empty farmhouse, another farm absorbed into the operation next door, another family's agricultural heritage erased. Fact 5. Between April 2024 and March 2025, over 250 farms in the United States went bankrupt. That's more than one every weekday. Every Monday through Friday, somewhere in America, a farm fails. And again, that's just the official bankruptcies. That's just the families who went through the legal process. The real number of farms that ceased operation is far higher. The financial strain mirrors the farm crisis of the 1980s, the worst agricultural economic disaster since the Great Depression. For those who lived through the 1980s farm crisis, this feels like a terrible replay. The same crushing debt, the same low commodity prices, the same sense of helplessness as forces beyond your control destroy your livelihood. Back then, farm foreclosure sales became sites of protest, with neighbors showing up to bid pennies on equipment worth thousands, trying to keep auctioneers from selling out their friends. Some counties passed laws prohibiting sheriffs from serving foreclosure notices. The Farm Aid Concerts, organized by Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young, raised money and awareness. But even with all that, over 900 farmers in 5 Midwestern states died by suicide during those years. The crisis broke people, broke families, broke communities. And now it's happening again. Different causes, trade wars instead of Soviet grain embargoes, corporate consolidation instead of just high interest rates, but the same devastating effect on farm families. Fact 6. Production expenses hit record levels of $467 billion in 2025. That's nearly $12 billion higher than 2024, $50 billion above the previous 5-year average, and $85 billion above the 10-year average. Every single cost category is rising. Seed prices are up. Fertilizer costs remain elevated well above pre-2021 levels. Fuel and oil, despite periodic dips, average far higher than a decade ago. Equipment costs have skyrocketed. That $485,000 combine mentioned earlier cost $250,000 just 15 years ago. Land rent has more than doubled in many regions. Insurance premiums are higher. Maintenance costs are up because when farmers can't afford new equipment, they keep older machines running and repair bills pile up. Take fertilizer as an example. Global fertilizer prices spiked to unprecedented levels in 2022, driven by natural gas prices, supply chain disruptions, and the war in Ukraine. While prices have retreated from those peaks, they remain roughly 60 to 80% higher than they were in 2019. For a farmer like Tom, who needs about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre on 1,200 acres, that means an annual fertilizer bill that went from $70,000 in 2019 to over $130,000 in 2025. That's an extra $60,000 per year just for fertilizer. Where does that money come from? It doesn't come from higher crop prices. It comes from reduced income, from draining savings, from taking on more debt. Fact 7. Commodity prices have plummeted from their 2022 highs, creating a persistent imbalance. Crop revenues continue to decline while expenses remain stubbornly high, leaving farmers with few options beyond drawing down equity, tapping reserves, or taking on costly debt. Corn prices that briefly touched $7.50 per bushel in 2022 have fallen back to around $4.20. Soybeans that peaked near $17 per bushel now trade around $10.50. Wheat prices have similarly crashed. Cotton prices are down. This price collapse happened even though demand remained strong, even though production in many regions was down, even though by all traditional market logic, prices should be higher. But agricultural markets don't follow traditional logic anymore. They follow the logic of consolidated industries, where a few buyers control the market, where global trade flows can shift suddenly based on geopolitics, where financial speculation in commodity futures can drive prices independent of actual supply and demand fundamentals. The result is a scissors effect, expenses rising on one side, revenues falling on the other, and farmers caught in between, getting squeezed tighter and tighter until something breaks. Usually what breaks is the farmer. Fact 8. Strong yields provide little relief. In fact, they often make things worse. An abundant harvest means nothing when the market is flooded and prices crash. This is the paradox of modern agriculture. Producing more can mean earning less. The imbalance has driven profit margins to the point where breaking even is unachievable for many row crop farmers. In 2023, for example, farmers in Iowa and Illinois produced record corn and soybean crops. The weather cooperated, the technology performed, the plants produced prolifically, and those farmers lost money, lots of money, because everyone else also produced record crops. The market flooded. Grain elevators ran out of storage space. Prices crashed. And farmers who had produced 220 bushel per acre corn discovered that high yields at $4 per bushel is worse than average yields at $6 per bushel. This is what happens in a system with no supply management. When times are good, everyone plants every possible acre. When times are bad, everyone still plants every acre because they have to. They have debt to service, equipment to justify, land rent to pay. The result is chronic overproduction, which drives down prices, which forces farmers to produce even more to try to make up in volume what they're losing in price, which drives down prices further. It's a death spiral disguised as productivity. Fact 9. China, once the largest customer for U.S. soybeans, has shifted heavily towards South America. Brazil's soybean production has exploded, going from about 50 million tons in the early 2000s to over 150 million tons in recent years. Argentina produces another 50 million tons. Together, Brazil and Argentina now export more soybeans than the United States. And China, which is by far the world's largest soybean importer, increasingly buys from South America instead of American farmers. Brazilian farmers offer competitive prices, good quality, and better relationships unencumbered by trade tensions. American soybean farmers watch their traditional markets disappear, powerless to compete. This shift represents more than just market competition. It represents a fundamental restructuring of global agricultural trade. For decades, American farmers dominated global commodity exports. No longer. And there's no clear path back. You can't tell Brazilian farmers to stop growing soybeans. You can't rebuild trade relationships overnight after years of tariffs and trade wars. The market share once lost is nearly impossible to recapture. Fact 10. Export demand has collapsed in many categories. Agricultural exports between January and August of one recent year were down 5%, or $5.6 billion, compared to the same period the previous year. That's $5.6 billion in lost revenue for American farmers. The Trump administration made $16 billion in aid available to farmers affected by trade wars. But small farmers complained that the bulk of the money went to huge producers with large crop losses. The very biggest operations, some of them corporate-owned, collected hundreds of thousands or even millions in trade aid. Small and medium-sized family farms got a few $1,000s, nowhere near enough to offset their losses. This pattern, large operations capturing the bulk of government benefits, repeats across all subsidy and aid programs. The payments are tied to production volume. If you farm 10,000 acres, you get 10 times the payment of someone farming 1,000 acres. So the aid that's supposed to help struggling family farmers actually accelerates consolidation by providing windfall profits to the largest operations while providing inadequate assistance to everyone else. The money problems lead to something even darker, something we don't like to talk about in polite company, something that gets whispered about at funerals but never discussed openly at the coffee shop or the farm bureau meetings. When farmers can't pay their bills, when the farm that's been in their family for generations faces foreclosure, when every possible solution has been tried and failed, when the shame of failure becomes too heavy to carry, the toll isn't just financial, it's mortal. Fact 11. Farmers have one of the highest suicide rates of any occupation in America. The suicide rate among male farmers, ranchers, and agricultural managers is 52. 1 per 100,000 compared to 32. 0 per 100,000 among male working-aged adults across all occupations. That's 62% higher. Among women in agriculture, the rate is also elevated. These aren't just numbers. These are husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. These are people who loved the land, who wanted to pass something on to the next generation, who worked themselves to exhaustion trying to keep the dream alive. Picture the scene. It's usually dawn or dusk, the in-between times when farmers are alone with their thoughts. Maybe he's in the barn, ostensibly checking on equipment or livestock. Maybe she's in the farm office, supposedly going over bills. The family is in the house, unaware. And in that moment of solitude, the weight becomes too much. The debt that can't be repaid, the bank that's threatening foreclosure, the shame of failure, the knowledge that the farm will be lost, the feeling that the family would be better off with the life insurance money than with a failed farmer. The decision happens in those moments, not usually after long deliberation, but suddenly, impulsively, when pain overwhelms every other consideration. A gun from the cabinet, a rope in the barn, carbon monoxide in an enclosed space, methods that are available, that are final, that end the pain instantly, and then the family finds them. A wife walking out to the barn calling her husband's name, a son going to get his father for dinner, a daughter checking on her mother in the garage. The discovery is traumatic beyond description. The guilt, could I have prevented this? Why didn't I see the signs? Never entirely fades. The funeral where everyone knows it was suicide but nobody says it aloud. The relatives flying in, the neighbors bringing casseroles, the pastor giving a sermon about God's mercy, the sale of the farm to pay debts and final expenses, the scattering of the family, the end of generations of agricultural heritage. This scene plays out over and over across rural America, not every day, but far too often. And for every completion, there are attempts that failed, interventions that worked, moments of crisis that were survived. The documented suicides represent only the most visible edge of a mental health crisis that affects tens of thousands of farm families. Fact 12. Farmers are 3-5 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. 3.5 times. That's not a small difference. That's not statistical noise. That's a crisis. And it's been a crisis for decades, largely ignored because it happens in rural areas, spread across thousands of counties, invisible to urban media and policymakers. Each death is a private family tragedy, not a public event. There's no mass casualty incident that makes headlines, just a steady drumbeat of individual deaths, week after week, year after year, accumulating into a staggering toll. Fact 13. More than 900 farmers took their own lives in 5 upper Midwestern states during the 1980s farm crisis. That was during a period when national attention finally focused on the farm crisis, when farm aid concerts raised millions, when Congress passed emergency relief. Even with all that attention, even with policy responses, even with community support, 900 farmers died by their own hand. The economic devastation overwhelmed every intervention. And between 2014 and 2018, over 450 more farmers in those same states committed suicide. Around 150 of those deaths occurred just between 2017 and 2018. The actual total is believed to be much higher because not every state provided complete suicide data for each year. Some redacted portions of the data citing privacy concerns, and some deaths were reported as agricultural accidents, a coding issue that masks the true extent of the crisis. A death from asphyxiation in a grain bin might be classified as an accident. A death from a fall from farm equipment might be ruled accidental. A single vehicle crash into a tree on a rural road late at night might be deemed an accident. But families know, communities know, they just don't talk about it. Fact 14. Over 70% of farmer suicides occurred by firearm. This makes sense in a grim way. Farmers have ready access to guns. They're tools of the trade, for dispatching injured animals, for pest control, for protection in remote locations. They're kept loaded and accessible because you never know when you'll need them. And in a moment of crisis, that accessibility becomes fatal. Research on suicide shows that access to lethal means dramatically increases the risk of completion. People in acute suicidal crisis often act impulsively. If they survive that moment, most don't go on to die by suicide later. But if they have immediate access to a highly lethal method like a firearm, the window between thought and action can close in seconds, giving no time for intervention, no opportunity for reconsideration. Rural suicide prevention efforts often focus on means safety, encouraging farmers to store firearms locked and unloaded, to create even a small barrier between impulse and action. But it's a hard sell. Farmers are independent people who don't like being told what to do with their property. And the cultural resistance to discussing mental health in farming communities means many never hear the message at all. Fact 15. In the Midwest alone, over 1,500 farmers have taken their own lives since the 1980s. Each one represents a family shattered, a community diminished, a legacy ended. 1,500 families, 1,500 funerals, 1,500 farms either sold or absorbed by neighbors, 1,500 sets of children who grew up without a parent, carrying trauma and grief that shapes their entire lives, 1,500 spouses left behind, often in dire financial circumstances, trying to pick up pieces while drowning in their own grief. The ripple effects extend outward. the best friend who wonders why he didn't notice the signs, the neighbor who last spoke to him 3 days before and heard something in his voice but didn't follow up, the banker who sent the foreclosure notice, the insurance agent who helped get the life insurance policy, the local pastor who conducts the funeral, the mental health counselor who never got the call for help. Everyone affected, everyone carrying some piece of the tragedy, everyone wondering if they could have made a difference. Fact 16. The mental health crisis mirrors a global pattern. This isn't just an American problem. It's a problem wherever agriculture is in economic crisis, wherever farmers face similar pressures of debt, low prices, corporate consolidation, and climate uncertainty. In Australia, a farmer dies by suicide every 10 days. In the United Kingdom, one farmer a week takes their own life. In France, it's one every 2 days. And in India, the scale is almost incomprehensible. Almost 300,000 farmers have died by suicide since 1995. 300,000. That number is so large it's almost impossible to process. But each one was a person. Each one had a family, a village, a plot of land they were trying to work. In India, the triggers are slightly different. Drought, crop failure, inability to repay loans to informal moneylenders charging usurious rates, the shame of debt. But the underlying dynamic is the same. Farmers pushed to the breaking point by economic systems that value their production, but not their survival. This global pattern tells us something important. This isn't about individual weakness or mental illness in the traditional sense. This is about structural economic factors that create unbearable pressure. You can't counsel your way out of debt. You can't positive think your way to profitability when crop prices are below the cost of production. The mental health crisis in agriculture is fundamentally an economic crisis that manifests as a mental health crisis. Fact 17. Studies show farmers have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide risk than the general population. Agriculture is recognized as a stressful occupational industry, characterized by extreme environmental conditions, fluctuating markets, high production costs, high debt loads, and interpersonal family conflict. The stress comes from multiple directions simultaneously. There's financial stress, the debt, the uncertain income, the dependence on factors beyond your control like weather and commodity markets. There's physical stress, the long hours, the manual labor, the occupational hazards, the chronic pain that accumulates over years of hard work. There's emotional stress, the responsibility of stewarding land that's been in your family for generations, the pressure of providing for your family, the isolation of rural life. And there's often family stress. Many farms are family operations where spouses work together, where children are expected to help, where decisions about the farm are decisions about the family's future. When the farm struggles, the family struggles. Arguments about money intersect with arguments about the farm. Should we take on more debt? Should we sell land? Should we keep trying or quit? These questions aren't abstract business decisions. They're existential questions about identity, legacy, and family bonds. Furthermore, farming can involve intense conflict between generations. A son who wants to try organic methods but whose father insists on conventional approaches. A daughter who sees the writing on the wall and wants to transition into something else, but whose parents plead with her to keep the farm going. These conflicts occur in the context of living and working together every day, often on the same property, sometimes in the same house. There's no escape, no separation between work and home, between business relationships and family relationships. The stress is constant and inescapable. Fact 18. Despite knowing they're at risk, less than 10% of farmers who died by suicide had documented financial problems, job problems, or family relationship problems listed as precipitating circumstances. They suffered in silence, keeping their struggles hidden until it was too late. This speaks to the cultural factors that make farmer mental health such a difficult issue to address. In many farming communities, there's a strong ethic of self-reliance. You handle your own problems. You don't complain. You don't burden others. Asking for help is seen as weakness. This cultural attitude serves farmers well in many circumstances. It builds resilience, grit, the ability to endure hardship. But it becomes deadly when problems exceed individual capacity to solve them. When you need help but can't ask for it because asking violates your core identity as an independent, self-sufficient person, you end up suffering alone. And alone, problems can seem insurmountable when they might be manageable with support. There's also often an element of shame. In a community where farming is the primary identity and livelihood, failing at farming feels like failing at life itself. The farmer who's losing his farm may feel he's letting down his ancestors who worked this land, letting down his children who won't inherit it, letting down his community that depends on agriculture. That shame becomes a barrier to seeking help. It's easier to suffer in silence than to admit failure to friends and neighbors who might judge you. Fact 19. Mental health services are largely unavailable in rural areas where most farms are located. In 2018, 79% of rural non-adjacent counties, meaning counties that aren't near any city, had no psychiatrists at all. Zero. None. Even counties that have some mental health services typically have waiting lists of months. If you're in crisis, you can't wait 3 months for an appointment. And the services that do exist are often poorly suited to farmers' needs and schedules. Appointments during business hours don't work when you're planting or harvesting. Counselors trained in urban settings may not understand the specific stressors farmers face. Even if services are available and accessible, there's the issue of privacy. In small rural communities, everyone knows everyone. Going to see the local counselor means your truck is parked at their office where everyone driving by can see it. In the waiting room, you might encounter your neighbor, your banker, your insurance agent. The lack of anonymity makes people reluctant to seek help. Telehealth has expanded access somewhat, allowing farmers to connect with mental health professionals remotely. But internet connectivity in rural areas is often poor. And there's still the barrier of cost. Mental health services often aren't covered by insurance, or they require copies that struggling farm families can't afford. Fact 20. During the spring of 2019, one clinical psychologist and farmer from Iowa, Mike Rosman, who specializes in agricultural behavioral health, received 7 calls per week from farmers having mental health crises related to their farm's finances. 7 per week to just one provider. One farmer called to say he was considering suicide after floods destroyed the corn he'd already harvested and stored in a grain elevator. Neither crop insurance nor flood insurance would cover his loss. He'd done everything right, grew a good crop, stored it properly, had insurance. But the insurance policies had exclusions that didn't cover this particular type of flood damage. He lost a year's income through no fault of his own, and he had no recourse. He felt trapped, he felt hopeless, and he was seriously considering ending his life. Dr. Rosman was able to talk him through the immediate crisis, connect him with resources, help him see that there were options even if they weren't obvious in that moment of despair. But Dr. Rosman is one person. There are only a handful of providers in the entire country who specialize in agricultural behavioral health. The need vastly exceeds the available resources. Hotlines help. The Agri-Stress Helpline, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, and various state-level farm stress hotlines provide immediate support. These lines are staffed 24/7, and workers can assess immediate needs, intervene in crisis situations, and connect callers with ongoing support. During the 1980s farm crisis, research showed that states with telephone hotlines saw reduced numbers of farming-related suicides. The hotlines work, but again, they require farmers to actually call, which requires overcoming the cultural barriers to asking for help. Peer support networks have also proven effective. When farmers talk to other farmers who have been through similar struggles, the shame diminishes. There's an understanding that doesn't exist with counselors who have never farmed. Organizations like Farm Aid, farmer wellness programs in various states, and grassroots support groups provide spaces where farmers can share their struggles without judgment. These programs are underfunded and understaffed, but they make a real difference for the people they reach. The despair doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from watching everything you've worked for slip away, piece by piece. Fact 21. Since 1980, the United States has lost over 50% of its farms. Half of all farms gone in 4 decades. Fact 22. The number of farms declined from nearly 8 million in 1954 to 2 million in 2014. Most of the same land is still being farmed, but by far fewer people on far larger operations. Fact 23. There were 70% fewer hog farmers in the mid-2010s than in the mid-1990s. Meanwhile, just 4 companies control 2/3 of hog slaughter. Fact 24. Nearly 17,000 cattle ranchers have gone out of business each year since 1980. The consolidation is relentless, grinding down independent producers year after year. Fact 25. Corporate consolidation has reshaped American agriculture into an oligopoly. In most sectors of the economy, concentration ratios around 40% indicate competition is threatened. Almost every sector in agriculture is well above that level. Fact 26. The top 4 companies control 85% of the beef market, 85% of the corn seed market, and 90% of grain trading. 20% of farms control nearly 70% of U.S. farmland. Fact 27. 3 fertilizer companies control 93% of nitrogen fertilizer sales in North America. 4 seed companies control over 60% of the global seed market. 2 farm machinery giants dominate tractor and combine sales. Fact 28. The dairy industry tells the same story. Dairy Farmers of America, the largest dairy cooperative, paid $50 million to settle allegations that it conspired to monopolize the Northeast milk market. Fact 29. America's dairy farms are disappearing. The country has lost 95% of its dairy farms since the 1970s, with ongoing consolidation squeezing out family operations. Fact 30. The average age of American farmers is approaching 60 years old. The farmer pipeline is drying up. Fewer young people are entering agriculture, and those who try face insurmountable barriers to entry. When a handful of corporations control the entire food system from seed to supermarket shelf, they control farmers too. They squeeze them from both ends, charging monopoly prices for inputs while paying monopsony prices for outputs. The farmer is caught in a vice that tightens year after year. Fact 31. Farmers rely on both buyers and sellers for their business. Concentrated markets squeeze them from both sides. They buy seeds, fertilizer, and equipment from monopolies, then sell their crops and livestock to monopolies. In economic terms, farmers face monopoly power when they buy and monopsony power when they sell. The worst possible combination. They have no leverage on either side of the transaction. They're price takers in markets where prices are increasingly divorced from supply and demand fundamentals, and instead reflect the market power of consolidated corporations. Think about the farmer's position. You need seed to plant. Bayer controls 25% of the global seed market. Corteva controls another 20%. You have choices, technically, but when 2 companies control nearly half the market and the next 2 control another 20%, those aren't meaningful choices. The prices are similar, the terms are similar. You buy seed from one of the big 4 or you don't farm. Same story with chemicals. You need herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. Bayer, BASF, Corteva, and ChemChina control the vast majority of that market too. Often it's the same companies selling both seed and chemicals, because the seed is genetically engineered to work with that company's chemicals. Bayer's Roundup Ready soybeans are designed to tolerate their glyphosate herbicide. Farmers are locked into systems, buying seed and chemicals as packages. Equipment follows the same pattern. John Deere sells over 50% of large tractors and 63% of combines. CNH Industrial, which owns Case IH and New Holland, is their main competitor. Together, these two companies dominate. Farmers talk about being John Deere guys or Case guys, brand loyalty built over generations. But it's not really loyalty when switching brands requires entirely new equipment and the proprietary technology locks you in. Then harvest comes. You've grown your crop. Now you need to sell it. In most rural areas, there are 2, maybe 3 grain elevators within practical hauling distance. Those elevators are often owned by companies like Cargill or ADM or farmer cooperatives that themselves are tied into contracts with the big grain traders. You call for quotes. They're all within pennies of each other. You take the best price, which is still below your cost of production, and you deliver your grain. You have no bargaining power. You can't hold out for a better price. You have bills to pay, debt to service. And if you try to store grain hoping prices will rise, you incur storage costs and risk quality deterioration. The system forces you to sell. Cattle producers face an even more concentrated market. 4 beef packers control 85% of slaughter capacity. When you have cattle ready for market, you have limited options. The packer bids a price based on what they call the market, but since they are the market, they set the price through their collective bidding. The price reflects their power, not true supply and demand. Cattle producers have watched the spread between what they receive for cattle and what consumers pay for beef widen dramatically over decades. That spread represents value captured by the packers and retailers, extracted from both producers and consumers. Fact 32. Farmers now earn just 14 cents for every dollar spent on food. 14 cents, less than 15%. The rest goes to processors, distributors, and retailers. In the 1970s, farmers received around 30 to 40 cents of the food dollar. The share has been cut in half. Where did it go? To the middlemen, to the corporations that process food, package it, market it, and sell it. They've captured more and more of the value, while the people who actually grow the food receive less and less. When you buy a loaf of bread for $3, $50, the wheat farmer who grew the wheat that made the flour that was used in that loaf receives maybe $0, 20 cents. The rest goes to the mill that ground the wheat, the bakery that made the bread, the distributor who transported it, the store that sold it. Each entity in that chain extracts value. The wheat farmer who took all the production risk, who invested capital in land and equipment, who worked the land, they get a nickel per dollar of final product. It's an extraction system, and farmers are on the losing end. Fact 33. Vertical integration means corporations own every step of the supply chain. A company like Smithfield, owned by Chinese company WH Group, controls feed production, breeding stock, grow-out operations, slaughter, processing, and often distribution. All profits flow back to the corporation, not to independent farmers or local communities. Independent hog farmers have largely been replaced by contract growers who own only the buildings and their labor, while the company owns everything else. This vertical integration model eliminates risk for the corporation and transfers it to the farmer. The company doesn't own the expensive buildings. The farmer does, financed through debt. The company doesn't bear the risk of disease or bad genetics. The farmer does. If mortality is high, the farmer gets paid less. If feed conversion is poor, the farmer gets paid less. If the company decides to source from a different region or country, they simply terminate contracts, and the farmer is stuck with useless buildings and unpayable debt. For communities, vertical integration is devastating. It used to be that a meatpacking plant would source hogs from thousands of independent farmers within a 100-mile radius. Those farmers bought feed from local mills, consulted with local veterinarians, borrowed from local banks, sold equipment to each other. Money circulated through the community. When one company vertically integrates, all of that economic activity gets internalized within the company. The only local input is the contract grower's labor. Everything else, the profit, the feed production, the veterinary services, the genetics, flows to the company, often headquartered hundreds or thousands of miles away. Fact 34. When corporations consolidate, small towns die. Local feed mills close because the integrated corporations produce their own feed. Local veterinarians lose business because company vets handle animal health. Local bank seed deposits dry up as farmers close and operations consolidate. Local equipment dealers lose sales. Local restaurants lose customers. Local schools lose students. The wealth that once circulated through rural communities gets siphoned to distant corporate headquarters, leaving rural America economically hollowed out. This process has been documented extensively. Numerous studies show that the consolidation and industrialization of agricultural operations results in lower incomes, greater income inequality and poverty, declining main streets, and fewer stores in rural communities. The pattern is consistent across regions and decades. When farming becomes more industrial and consolidated, rural communities suffer. It's not hard to see why. Imagine a town of 5,000 people supported by 100 family farms in the surrounding area. Each farm family shops locally, eats at local restaurants, uses local services. Their kids attend local schools. They volunteer in the community. They support the local economy directly and indirectly. Now imagine that consolidation reduces those 100 farms to 20 large operations, many owned by outside investors or managed by hired employees rather than family owners. The economic activity drops by more than 80%. The schools close for lack of students. The stores close for lack of customers. The town dies slowly, becoming a ghost town with boarded-up storefronts and a few elderly residents who remember better times. This has happened across rural America. Thousands of small towns are dying because agriculture, their economic foundation, has consolidated beyond the point where it can support a local community. It's not just sad, it's destructive to the social fabric of the country. Fact 35. Studies show that farms with gross income of $100,000 make nearly 95% of their expenditures locally. Farms with gross incomes above $900,000 spend less than 20% locally. This data point illustrates the multiplier effect of small farms versus large operations. Small farms buy from local suppliers. Large operations buy from the cheapest source regardless of location, often directly from manufacturers or through company contracts that specify suppliers. A Minnesota study documented this pattern clearly. Small dairy farms buy hay from neighbors, grain from local elevators, equipment parts from the local dealer, veterinary services from the local vet. Large dairies buy hay from brokers who source from hundreds of miles away, grain through corporate contracts, equipment parts directly from manufacturers with overnight shipping, and employ their own veterinary staff or contract with regional specialists. The economic benefit to the local community is dramatically different. This explains why rural communities often resist large concentrated animal feeding operations, even when proponents promise economic development. The community members understand, often from experience, that large operations don't benefit local economies the way smaller diversified farms do. The jobs created are often low-wage and dangerous. The economic activity is minimal. The environmental and quality of life costs are significant. It's not a good trade for communities, but they often lack the political power to say no when corporations and their allies push development. Fact 36. The consolidation and industrialization of agriculture has resulted in lower incomes, greater income inequality and poverty, declining main streets, and fewer stores in rural communities. The data has been consistent across numerous studies over the past 50 years. Every time researchers look, they find the same pattern. As agriculture industrializes and consolidates, rural communities decline. It's not speculation. It's empirical reality documented again and again. Yet agricultural policy continues to favor consolidation. Subsidies scale with production, benefiting the largest operations most. Regulations often exempt the largest operations or provide compliance pathways that only they can afford. Research funding at land-grant universities increasingly comes from corporate partnerships that direct research toward the needs of industrial agriculture rather than small and medium-sized farms. The system is rigged to favor consolidation, even though consolidation demonstrably harms rural communities. Fact 37. Politicians promise to help family farmers, but they rarely deliver. When Barack Obama campaigned in 2008 on enforcement of antitrust rules and breaking up agribusiness power, rural areas responded enthusiastically. They were desperate for someone to address corporate consolidation. Obama won Iowa, a traditionally Republican-leaning state, and performed well in rural areas across the Midwest. But his administration, despite launching a year-long Department of Justice and USDA investigation into agricultural consolidation in 2010, ultimately did nothing. No major antitrust actions, no breakups, no significant new regulations. The consolidation continued unabated. Rural voters noticed. Many flipped from Obama to Trump in 2016, partly out of economic frustration over the unfulfilled promises. Both parties have failed rural America on agricultural consolidation. Democrats launch investigations and hold hearings, but rarely take meaningful action, constrained by agribusiness lobbying and ideological discomfort with aggressive antitrust enforcement. Republicans talk about free markets, but allow the markets to become dominated by a few corporations, and they actively work to weaken regulations that might protect farmers and workers. Neither party has seriously challenged the corporate control of American agriculture for decades. Fact 38. The largest multinational corporations spend millions in direct lobbying and political donations. Bayer spent over $10 million on federal lobbying in a recent year. Smithfield, Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, Koch Industries, and others each spend millions annually. This money buys access and influence. When regulations are written, corporate lobbyists are in the room. When legislation is drafted, they provide input. When enforcement priorities are set, they weigh in. The result is a political system that's responsive to corporate interests, while farmers and rural communities lack comparable influence. Farm organizations like the American Farm Bureau theoretically represent farmers' interests, but many have been criticized for actually representing corporate agriculture. The Farm Bureau's main business is insurance. They operate FBL Financial Group, a large insurance company. Their policy positions often align with corporate agribusiness interests rather than small family farmers. When the Farm Bureau opposes right-to-repair legislation or supports policies that benefit large operations at the expense of small ones, whose interests are they really serving? Fact 39. Commodity checkoff programs, funded by mandatory taxes on farmers, have been used to lobby against the very farmers who pay into them. These programs, established by Congress, collect funds from farmers, for example, 15 cents per hundredweight of beef sold, to fund research and promotion. Sounds beneficial, but these checkoff programs have been repeatedly accused of funding lobbying activities that farmers oppose, supporting trade groups that work against farmer interests, and operating without adequate transparency or accountability. Farmers pay the tax whether they want to or not, and the money gets used in ways they don't control and often don't support. For example, beef checkoff funds have been used to support trade agreements that farmers believe hurt their interests. Checkoff-funded organizations have lobbied against mandatory country of origin labeling, which many cattle producers support. The system turns farmer dollars into tools of corporate influence, and farmers have limited recourse because checkoff funding is mandatory. Fact 40. The Farm Bureau claims to be the voice of agriculture, but its real business is selling insurance. Its positions often align with corporate interests rather than family farmers. This creates a problematic situation where the largest and most visible farm organization in America, the one that politicians turn to as representing farmer interests, actually represents a complex mix of insurance business interests, large farm interests, and corporate agriculture interests. Small and medium-sized family farmers often find that the Farm Bureau's positions don't align with their interests, but the Bureau's size and resources allow it to claim to speak for all of agriculture. Fact 31. Farmers rely on both buyers and sellers for their business. Concentrated markets squeeze them from both sides. They buy seeds, fertilizer, and equipment from monopolies, then sell their crops and livestock to monopolies. Fact 32. Farmers now earn just 14 cents for every dollar spent on food. The rest goes to processors, distributors, and retailers. The people who actually grow the food get the smallest slice. Fact 33. Vertical integration means corporations own every step of the supply chain. A company like Smithfield controls feed production, breeding, slaughter, and processing. All profits flow back to the corporation, not to independent farmers or local communities. Fact 34. When corporations consolidate, small towns die. Local feed mills close. Local veterinarians lose business. Local banks see deposits dry up. The wealth that once circulated through rural communities gets siphoned to distant corporate headquarters. Fact 35. Studies show that farms with gross income of $100,000 made nearly 95% of their expenditures locally. Farms with gross incomes above $900,000 spent less than 20% locally. Big agriculture doesn't support local economies. Fact 36. The consolidation and industrialization of agriculture has resulted in lower incomes, greater income inequality and poverty, declining main streets, and fewer stores in rural communities. The data is consistent across numerous studies over the past 50 years. Fact 37. Politicians promise to help family farmers, but they rarely deliver. When Barack Obama campaigned on enforcement of antitrust rules and breaking up agribusiness power in 2008, rural areas responded. But his administration allowed continued consolidation. Rural voters noticed. Fact 38. The largest multinational corporations spend millions in direct lobbying and political donations. Bayer, Smithfield, Archer Daniels Midland, and others pour money into making sure regulations favor their interests, not farmers' interests. Fact 39. The Farm Bureau claims to be the voice of agriculture, but its real business is selling insurance. Its positions often align with corporate interests rather than family farmers. Fact 40. Commodity checkoff programs, funded by mandatory taxes on farmers, have been used to lobby against the very farmers who pay into them. Farmer dollars become tools of corporate influence. While corporate monopolies crush independent farmers, the people who actually do the physical labor in American agriculture, the workers in the fields and the plants, face conditions that most Americans would find shocking if they knew about them. These are the invisible people who make modern agriculture possible, working in some of the most dangerous conditions in American industry, often for poverty wages, frequently without legal protection, sometimes literally dying on the job. Fact 41. Over 330,000 women and men work in meat and poultry slaughtering and processing plants. These workers, overwhelmingly immigrants and people of color, perform some of the most difficult, dangerous, and traumatic work in America. They stand for hours in cold, wet conditions, wielding sharp knives and scissors, making thousands of repetitive motions every day, while animals and meat products rush past on conveyor belts, moving so fast that injuries are nearly inevitable. The work ranks among the most dangerous jobs in American manufacturing. Imagine standing in a refrigerated room kept at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You're wearing rubber boots, a smock, a hairnet, and ear protection because the noise from machinery is deafening. Your hands are cold even through the gloves. You're holding a knife that you've sharpened multiple times today because it dulls quickly from constant use. Chickens are coming down the line at a rate of 140 birds per minute. Your job is to make a specific cut on each bird, maybe removing the skin, maybe cutting away a particular portion, maybe trimming fat. You have less than half a second per bird. Your hands and arms move in a blur. The supervisor watches the line constantly, pressure to keep the speed up, never letting it slow. By the end of your shift, you've made that same motion 30,000 to 40,000 times. Your hands hurt, your shoulders hurt, your back hurts, but tomorrow you'll do it again. That's the reality for poultry workers. For beef and pork workers, the animals are larger, the knives heavier, the cuts more forceful. The danger is amplified. Workers describe the kill floor, where live animals are stunned and bled, as a blood-soaked nightmare of noise, smell, and death. The fabrication floor, where carcasses are broken down into retail cuts, is slightly more controlled but still dangerous, with workers wielding knives and saws inches from each other. Everyone moving fast, one slip potentially catastrophic. Fact 42. 81% of meatpacking workers face high injury risk, according to studies by the USDA. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that meat and poultry workers sustain serious injuries and illnesses at rates more than triple the average for all private industry. They're injured at work more frequently than construction workers, more frequently than manufacturing workers, more frequently than almost any other occupation except perhaps logging. And those statistics almost certainly undercount the true injury rate. Fact 43. The industry consistently undercounts injuries. Government investigations have repeatedly found that meatpacking companies fail to report injuries to avoid regulatory scrutiny and keep their reported injury rates low. Workers with sprains, lacerations, or other injuries are often treated by company medical staff and sent back to work without official reports being filed. OSHA inspections have documented this pattern across multiple companies and multiple plants. The official statistics, as bad as they are, don't capture the full reality. Workers fear reporting injuries because doing so can lead to retaliation. They might be assigned worse jobs, have their hours cut, or be fired. Immigrant workers, especially those who are undocumented or on temporary visas, face additional pressure to stay silent. If they complain, they risk losing not just their jobs but their ability to remain in the country. The companies know this and exploit it. They create workplace cultures where injuries are expected, where toughness means working through pain, where asking for help is viewed as weakness. Fact 44. Workers make thousands of repetitive motions every day. A typical poultry worker handles dozens of birds per minute, 60, 80, even more, making the same forceful cut over and over. The furious pace causes chronic physical ailments called musculoskeletal disorders, injuries to muscles, tendons, ligaments, and nerves that cause sprains, strains, inflammation, and permanent damage. Carpal tunnel syndrome is epidemic among meatpacking workers. Tendinitis is common. Chronic shoulder and back problems plague workers who have been on the line for years. These aren't the kind of injuries that heal fully. They're the kind that accumulate over time until workers' bodies break down completely and they can't work anymore. Teresa, whose story was documented in an NPR investigation, stuffed meat into bags at a pork processing plant for years. She developed severe carpal tunnel syndrome in both wrists. The repetitive motion of gripping, stuffing, and sealing hundreds of bags per hour destroyed the nerves in her hands. She finally had surgery, but the damage was permanent. She still has numbness and pain. She can't do the fine motor tasks she used to do. Her career in meatpacking is over, but she's only in her 40s, and now she has to figure out how to support herself with hands that don't work properly. Fact 45. Amputations in poultry workers are almost 5 times the average for all industries. Meatpacking workers suffer amputations at even higher rates, sometimes 10 times the national average. Fingers get caught in machinery. Knives slip. Cutting equipment malfunctions. Workers lose fingertips, whole fingers, sometimes hands. These are life-altering injuries that happen because the pace is so fast and the environment so dangerous that mistakes become inevitable. No amount of training or caution can fully prevent injuries when you're working at speeds that push human limits. The injuries are often described in clinical language: laceration requiring medical attention, amputation of distal phalanx, degloving injury. But each clinical description represents immense human suffering. The moment of the injury, the sudden pain, the blood, the realization that something terrible has happened. The emergency care, often delivered at on-site clinics that may not be adequately equipped. The recovery, surgery, physical therapy, lost wages, fear about the future. The long-term consequences, chronic pain, reduced function, inability to do the work you did before, financial hardship. Fact 46. Workers stand close together in cold, damp, dangerously loud conditions, wielding knives and scissors. They work in refrigerated environments where temperatures are kept low to preserve meat quality. The cold makes the work harder, hands get stiff, reaction time slow, and the risk of slips and falls on wet, slippery floors increases. The noise from machinery, conveyors, saws, refrigeration units, often exceeds safe levels, causing hearing damage over time. Workers breathe ammonia fumes from refrigeration systems, which can irritate eyes, throats, and lungs. The overall environment is hostile to human health and comfort, designed to move meat efficiently with little regard for worker well-being. Imagine doing this work 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week. Your commute home, exhausted, soreness in muscles you didn't know you had, falling into bed only to wake up and do it again. Living for the weekend when maybe your body gets a chance to recover slightly, though recovery time decreases as injuries accumulate. This is the reality for hundreds of thousands of workers in America's meatpacking industry. Fact 47. Annual turnover in meat and poultry plants averages between 60 and 150%. That means a typical plant replaces more than its entire workforce every year, sometimes twice over. Workers can't sustain the pace and the conditions. Their bodies break down. They quit. New workers come in, often through temp agencies or labor contractors. They last a few months or a year. They quit or get injured. More new workers arrive. The industry treats workers as interchangeable parts to be used up and replaced. Fact 48. 72% of workers surveyed at poultry plants reported a significant work-related injury or illness. 62% of meatpacking workers reported experiencing an injury during a single year. Fact 49. Repetitive stress injuries among meatpacking workers occur at rates about 30 times the national average. Carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, and other chronic conditions plague workers who have spent years on the line. Fact 50. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration lacks the resources to adequately inspect workplaces. In 2019, it would have taken OSHA 162 years to do just one inspection of each workplace in its jurisdiction. Fact 51. When OSHA inspectors arrive at plants, guards at the front gates signal workers. The chain slows down. More workers are added to the line. Once inspectors leave, conditions return to normal. Fact 52. OSHA continues to reject suggestions that it has authority over production speeds, despite the direct link between line speeds and worker injuries. This regulatory gap leaves workers unprotected from the root cause of many injuries. Fact 53. The U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees the factory line but concentrates solely on food safety. Worker safety falls through the cracks between agencies. Fact 54. Most meatpacking workers are Black, Latinx, and immigrant workers earning low wages. Occupational segregation ensures that people of color are disproportionately represented in the most dangerous jobs. Fact 55. Nearly half of meatpacking workers live in families with low incomes, and about 1 in 8 have incomes below the poverty line. They endure dangerous conditions because they have no better options. The people who pick the crops and tend the livestock often face even worse conditions. Fact 56. More than 4 million workers in the United States are directly involved in tending crops and livestock, picking and packaging produce, and working in food processing. They are essential to the nation's food supply, yet many face exploitation and abuse. Fact 57. The rate of fatal work-related injuries among agricultural workers is 7 times higher than the rate among workers overall. It's 2 times higher than construction workers and those employed in mining. Fact 58. Farm workers earn some of the lowest wages in the labor market. Many work seasonally, without benefits, without job security, without a safety net. Fact 59. About 44% of non-H-2A crop workers are unauthorized immigrants. They have virtually no workplace rights in practice. Employers know this and exploit it. Fact 60. The H-2A temporary agricultural worker visa program has grown from 139,832 jobs in 2015 to around 370,000 in 2022. It provides labor for farms, but the program is deeply flawed. Fact 61. H-2A workers are legally tied to their employer. If they're fired, they become deportable. This creates an extreme power imbalance that leaves workers vulnerable to abuse. Fact 62. In a 2020 study, all 100 H-2A workers interviewed reported experiencing at least one serious legal violation of their rights. 94% experienced 3 or more violations. Fact 63. Wage theft is rampant in the H-2A program. Workers report being paid less than promised, having illegal deductions taken from their paychecks, or not being paid at all. Fact 64. H-2A workers are charged illegal recruitment fees by contractors in their home countries. Many arrive in the United States already thousands of dollars in debt, having taken out high-interest loans to pay recruiters. Fact 65. 47% of migrant workers took out loans to cover pre-employment costs, at interest rates ranging from 5 to 79%. Local banks and recruiters sometimes require workers to leave deeds to property or automobile titles as collateral. Fact 66. The U.S. Department of Labor obtained records showing $7.2 million in unpaid wages due to thousands of H-2A workers over a decade was never returned to them. It was sent to the U.S. Treasury instead. Officials defended the practice, saying transitory workers are too difficult to locate. Fact 67. H-2A workers report discrimination, sexual harassment, unsafe work conditions, and inhumane housing. Some describe their treatment as modern-day slavery. Fact 68. In one of the largest H-2A criminal cases ever, a federal judge described the abuse of workers as a form of modern-day slavery. The Operation Blooming Onion case in Georgia involved a criminal enterprise indicted on charges of racketeering and forced labor. Workers were underpaid, housed in horrific conditions, and threatened with violence and deportation. Fact 69. During the COVID-19 pandemic, meatpacking workers were deemed essential but not protected. As many as 269 meatpacking employees died, and 59,000 tested positive for the virus. Counties with slaughtering plants suffered disproportionately high rates of illness and death. Fact 70. Congressional hearings exposed how the country's largest meat companies actively endangered workers during the pandemic. They lobbied government to force workers to remain on the job despite dangerous conditions, and fought against implementing basic safety measures. Beyond the immediate physical dangers of the work, beyond the cuts and the crushing injuries and the repetitive stress, there's another invisible threat that stalks American agriculture: chemicals. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. The arsenal of modern agriculture that allows a few farmers to grow vast quantities of food, but comes at a cost measured in cancer diagnoses, neurological diseases, and reproductive disorders. Fact 71. Farmers with documented exposure to pesticides have greater than a 20% elevated risk of brain cancer. This isn't speculation or fear-mongering. This is the conclusion from a systematic review and meta-analysis of 40 years of epidemiologic literature, examining 52 separate studies involving thousands of farmers. The synthesis of all that research is clear. Farming, with its inherent pesticide exposure, is associated with increased brain cancer risk, 20% higher risk. For a disease that's already terrifying, that extra 20% represents real people, real families, real tragedies. Brain cancer is particularly cruel. It affects the organ that makes you who you are, your memory, your personality, your ability to think and speak and recognize the people you love. Treatment often involves surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, all targeting one of the most delicate structures in the human body. Survival rates, even with treatment, are often measured in months or a few years. And watching someone you love deteriorate from brain cancer, losing pieces of themselves week by week, it's a nightmare that pesticide exposure makes 20% more likely for farmers. Tom, the hypothetical Iowa farmer we discussed earlier, has been spraying pesticides for 30 years. He wears protective equipment when the weather's not too hot, but on 90-degree days, wearing a full suit and respirator while sitting in an enclosed tractor cab without air conditioning is unbearable. So sometimes he takes shortcuts. He's mixed thousands of gallons of herbicide over the years: glyphosate, 24D, dicamba, atrazine. He's sprayed hundreds of thousands of acres. He's breathed the mist. He's gotten it on his skin when filling the sprayer tank. He's eaten lunch without washing his hands first because the nearest place to wash up was half an hour away. All those little exposures add up. And now he's in the high-risk category for brain cancer, though he doesn't think about it most days. He can't think about it. If he did, he might not be able to get in the sprayer again, and the farming has to get done. Fact 72. Livestock farming is associated with a 34% greater risk of brain cancer compared to crop farming. The types and intensity of pesticide exposure vary by farming type, and livestock farmers, it turns out, face even higher risks. Why? Because livestock farmers use pesticides too. Insecticides to control flies and parasites in barns and on animals, herbicides on pastures and hay fields. But they also face additional exposures from zoonotic diseases, hormones used in livestock, and other chemicals specific to animal agriculture. The combination creates an even more dangerous exposure profile. Fact 73. Agricultural pesticide use has a cancer risk similar to tobacco smoking for several types of cancer. This comparison, from research published in 2024, should stop everyone in their tracks. We've spent decades and billions of dollars reducing tobacco use because of cancer risk. We've regulated tobacco advertising, imposed taxes, required warning labels, banned smoking in public places. We've treated tobacco exposure as a serious public health threat. And now research shows that pesticide exposure carries comparable cancer risks for certain cancers, yet we do relatively little to protect the people exposed. Farmers continue to spray. Regulations remain weak. Oversight is minimal. The public remains largely unaware. Fact 74. Pesticide exposure is linked to prostate cancer, lung cancer, ovarian cancer, rectal cancer, testicular cancer, skin cancer, breast cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, multiple myeloma, and leukemia. The list is staggering. It's not just one type of cancer, it's system-wide. Different pesticides target different biological pathways, but many interfere with cell division, hormone signaling, DNA repair, and immune function, all processes that, when disrupted, can lead to cancer. The epidemiological evidence has accumulated over decades. Study after study finds associations between pesticide exposure and elevated cancer risk. Some pesticides are endocrine disruptors, meaning they interfere with hormone systems. This can lead to reproductive cancers like breast, ovarian, prostate, and testicular cancer. Other pesticides damage DNA directly, increasing the risk of any cancer. Still others suppress immune function, reducing the body's ability to detect and destroy precancerous cells before they become tumors. The mechanisms vary, but the outcome is the same: higher cancer rates among people with pesticide exposure. Fact 75. Neurological diseases including Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, are associated with pesticide exposure. The chemicals that protect crops also poison the nervous systems of the people who apply them. This makes tragic sense when you consider how many pesticides work. They target insect nervous systems, disrupting neurotransmitter function, causing paralysis and death. They're designed to be neurotoxic. The assumption is that they're selective neurotoxins, harmful to insects but not to humans. But that assumption appears to be wrong. Parkinson's disease is particularly well documented. Multiple studies across different countries and decades have found elevated Parkinson's rates among farmers and others with occupational pesticide exposure. Parkinson's is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that causes tremors, rigidity, slow movement, and eventually severe disability. It usually develops later in life, meaning farmers who have spent decades exposed to pesticides start showing symptoms in their 60s or 70s. The disease slowly robs them of their ability to move, to speak clearly, to care for themselves. There's no cure, only treatments that temporarily manage symptoms while the underlying degeneration continues. Fact 76. Farmers face elevated risks of Parkinson's disease. Studies consistently show associations between pesticide exposure and neurodegenerative disorders. One particularly cruel irony: the independence and physical capability that define farming, the ability to work long hours, operate equipment, manage land, are precisely what Parkinson's takes away. A farmer with Parkinson's watches their body betray them, losing the physical competence that farming requires, often having to give up farming years before they intended. The disease doesn't just affect the individual. It can end farming legacies when younger generations must take over operations prematurely, or when farms must be sold because the farmer can no longer safely operate equipment. Fact 77. Reproductive disorders including spontaneous abortions, stillbirth, and reduced sperm quality are linked to pesticide exposure. The chemicals don't just harm the farmer, they affect their ability to have healthy children. Women who work with pesticides during pregnancy face higher risks of miscarriage. Couples trying to conceive may struggle with infertility. Children born to parents with high pesticide exposure show elevated rates of birth defects. This affects not just the current generation but future ones, potentially altering the genetic and developmental health of children who never directly encountered the chemicals. Farm families often don't connect reproductive problems to pesticide exposure. A miscarriage might be attributed to bad luck or stress. Fertility issues might be seen as a private medical matter. Birth defects might be blamed on genetics. The links to pesticide exposure remain hidden unless someone specifically investigates occupational exposures. And in rural areas with limited medical resources, those investigations often don't happen. Fact 78. Farmers and their families living near agricultural operations are exposed to pesticides through drift, contaminated water, and residues tracked into homes. Children in farming families show elevated pesticide levels in their bodies. This means the exposure isn't limited to the people actually applying pesticides. It spreads through the environment. When farmers spray fields, some pesticide drifts on the wind, settling on neighboring properties, gardens, playgrounds. It runs off into drainage ditches and streams. It gets tracked indoors on boots and clothing. Family members inhale it, ingest it through contaminated food and water, absorb it through skin contact. Children are particularly vulnerable because their developing bodies are more susceptible to chemical disruption. Their smaller body size means a given exposure results in higher dose per body weight. Their play behaviors, crawling on floors, putting things in their mouths, increase exposure opportunities. And they have more years ahead for cancers and chronic diseases to develop. Growing up on a farm has many benefits, but pesticide exposure is a serious hidden cost. Fact 79. Greenspace workers, including gardeners, landscapers, and golf course employees, face similar elevated cancer risks. They handle pesticides frequently and often lack proper protective equipment. Golf courses, in particular, use intensive chemical applications to maintain the perfect turf that players expect. The groundskeepers who apply those chemicals, who mow the grass, who work in those environments daily, face exposures comparable to or even exceeding those of farmers. Yet they're even less likely to have access to protective equipment or safety training. Many are immigrant workers or seasonal employees with little bargaining power. Fact 80. Studies show 70% of farm workers experience some sort of respiratory issue from prolonged exposure to poor air quality and toxic chemicals. Workers inhale inhalable particulate matter from animal feces, feed, and fungi. They breathe ammonia, a pungent gas released from urine and manure that damages the cilia of the throat and causes eye and respiratory irritation. They inhale hydrogen sulfide released from manure, which can cause eye irritation, low blood pressure, headaches, and chronic coughs. Day after day, year after year, their lungs are assaulted by toxic air that would never be tolerated in other workplaces. Respiratory protection, masks, respirators, could reduce these exposures, but they're often not provided or not required. Workers in confined animal feeding operations breathe some of the worst air in American industry with minimal protection. The result is chronic bronchitis, asthma, reduced lung function, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. Some workers develop permanent lung damage. The people who produce your food are sacrificing their respiratory health to do it. Meanwhile, the environmental cost of industrial agriculture keeps mounting. Fact 81. Factory farming operations generate massive amounts of waste. Concentrated animal feeding operations produce more waste than some cities, but often lack adequate treatment systems. Fact 82. Manure lagoons, sometimes covering several acres, hold millions of gallons of animal waste. When they overflow during storms or when containment systems fail, the pollution devastates waterways. Fact 83. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that 1 in 6 Americans contracts a foodborne illness like Salmonella or E. coli every year. Factory farming conditions, where manure-covered animals are packed into overcrowded feedlots, accelerate the spread of these illnesses. Fact 84. The origin of swine flu has been linked to unsanitary conditions on factory farms. Cramming thousands of animals together creates perfect conditions for diseases to emerge and spread. Fact 85. Because of unsanitary conditions, Animals on factory farms are administered antibiotics routinely, not to treat illness but to prevent it. When humans eat meat products, they ingest these antibiotics, increasing antibiotic resistance. Fact 86. The European Union banned the use of antibiotics for growth promotion in livestock in 2006. The United States has been slower to act, allowing continued overuse that threatens the effectiveness of antibiotics in human medicine. Fact 87. Agricultural production is among the leading causes of biodiversity loss globally. When food production interferes with regions designated for conservation, ecosystems collapse. Fact 88. Factory farming operations often locate in or near communities of color and low-income communities. Environmental racism means these communities bear the brunt of the pollution, the smell, the water contamination, and the health impacts. Fact 89. Climate change is both caused by and devastating to agriculture. Farming contributes significant greenhouse gas emissions, while increasingly extreme weather patterns destroy crops and strain farmers' resilience. Fact 90. Soil degradation from intensive monoculture farming threatens long-term productivity. Topsoil erodes, organic matter depletes, and the land becomes dependent on ever-increasing chemical inputs. The economic pressures and the dangerous conditions combine to create a labor crisis. Fact 91. There's a severe shortage of agricultural workers. The shortage of available workers is perhaps the most significant challenge facing U.S. agriculture. This year, the labor shortfall will exceed 400,000 jobs. Fact 92. The average age of American farmers is 58.6 years. More than 71% are male. The workforce is aging out with insufficient young people willing or able to take their place. Fact 93. Strict and inconsistent immigration enforcement has dissuaded both potential workers and agricultural investment. The uncertainty makes planning impossible for both workers and employers. Fact 94. Labor shortages are especially acute in fruit and vegetable production regions like California's Central Valley and the Southeast, where a significant portion of farm workers traditionally lack legal authorization. Fact 95. Policy instability creates chaos. Shifting enforcement on immigration, sudden increases in raids, and unexpected policy reversals disrupt farm operations that depend on immigrant labor. Fact 96. Federal investigations into wage and hour violations on farms dropped to an all-time low in 2022, with just over 1,000 completed investigations. The number fell further to 659 in 2024. Lack of enforcement means violations continue unchecked. Fact 97. The H-2A program expanded dramatically, but is plagued by bureaucratic delays and process inefficiencies. Many farms are left without sufficient labor during critical planting and harvest windows. Fact 98. The Department of Labor recently suspended enforcement of a regulation that expanded labor protections for farm workers. The 2024 rule was an insufficient but necessary step toward improving employer transparency and accountability, and its suspension leaves workers more vulnerable. Fact 99. Agricultural employers know that H-2A workers have no outside options if they want to stay in the United States. This leaves workers particularly vulnerable to workplace exploitation. Employers can underpay, overwork, and abuse workers, knowing that those workers can't complain without risking deportation. Fact 100. Despite all of this, Americans remain largely disconnected from the reality of where their food comes from. They see the pastoral images on packages and advertisements. They don't see the death, the suicide, the injuries, the exploitation, the chemical exposure, the monopoly control, or the environmental destruction. The highway stretches on ahead of you. The sun climbs higher. The fields roll past, amber waves of grain dancing in the wind. It still looks peaceful. It still looks like the America you learned about in school, the heartland, the breadbasket, the land of plenty. But now you know what's underneath that pretty picture. You know about the farmers who can't afford to keep farming, who work themselves to exhaustion and still can't make a profit, who look at that rope in the barn or that gun in the cabinet and think maybe their families would be better off with the life insurance. You know about the workers who spend their days covered in blood and animal waste, who lose fingers to the machines, who develop chronic pain that will never fully heal, who can't speak up about unsafe conditions because they'll be fired or deported. You know about the children growing up breathing pesticide drift, the communities drinking contaminated water, the independent farmers being squeezed out by corporations, the land being worked to death, the system that rewards scale over sustainability and profit over people. American agriculture is in crisis. Not the kind of crisis that makes headlines every day, but the kind that grinds people down slowly, year after year, until rural communities are hollowed out and the people who feed America can barely feed themselves. The corporate consolidation that started in the 1980s has created a food system where a handful of companies control everything from seed to supermarket shelf. They decide what gets planted, how it gets grown, how much farmers get paid, how workers are treated, and what ends up on American tables. Farmers used to be independent business people. Now they're trapped between monopolies that sell them inputs and monopolies that buy their outputs. The margins keep shrinking, the debt keeps growing, the pressure keeps mounting. And when that pressure becomes too much, when the bank sends another letter, when the crop fails, when the market crashes, when there's no way out and no one who understands, that's when we lose another farmer to suicide. That's when another family loses their farm, their legacy, their way of life. The workers in the fields and the plants fare no better. They do the back-breaking, dangerous work that makes modern agriculture possible, and they do it for poverty wages, often without legal protection, frequently suffering injuries that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The H-2A visa program was supposed to provide a legal pathway for agricultural workers. Instead, it's become a system that enables exploitation. Workers arrive in debt, are tied to a single employer, and have no realistic way to report abuse without losing everything. In the meatpacking plants, the line moves so fast that injuries are inevitable. Workers make the same motion thousands of times a day until their bodies break down. Carpal tunnel, tendinitis, chronic pain, and sometimes worse, amputations, severe trauma, even death. The companies know this happens. They've calculated that it's cheaper to deal with occasional lawsuits than to slow down the line. Meanwhile, the pesticides that make industrial agriculture possible are slowly poisoning the people who apply them. Brain cancer rates are elevated. Parkinson's disease is more common. Reproductive problems are documented. The farmers know the chemicals are dangerous, but they can't compete without using them. It's a devil's bargain. The environmental toll is easier to ignore because it's spread across millions of acres and dozens of watersheds. The topsoil washing away, the aquifers being depleted, the waterways choked with runoff, the biodiversity disappearing, the climate changing, all of it connected to the way we grow food. Factory farms produce more waste than cities but face less regulation. Manure lagoons cover acres, holding millions of gallons of animal waste. When they overflow, the pollution can be catastrophic, but the environmental laws that are supposed to prevent this often aren't enforced. The animals themselves suffer in ways most people don't want to think about. Chickens genetically bred to grow so fast their legs can't support their weight. Pigs confined to crates so small they can't turn around. Cattle standing in their own waste in overcrowded feedlots. The industrialization of agriculture has turned animals into production units, and the suffering is immense. And the consolidation keeps accelerating. Small farms keep closing. Big operations keep getting bigger. Corporate control keeps tightening. The diversity of American agriculture, The different crops, the different methods, the regional specializations, is being replaced by monoculture, standardization, and economies of scale that favor the largest operations. This isn't sustainable, not economically, not environmentally, not socially. You can't build a food system on the backs of farmers who can't make a living and workers who get maimed on the job. You can't keep poisoning the land and the people and expect the system to hold together. Something has to change. The antitrust laws need to be enforced. The monopolies need to be broken up. Farmers need fair prices. Workers need protection. The environment needs consideration beyond the next quarter's profits. But change is hard when the corporations that benefit from the current system have so much political power. When they can lobby Congress, when they can fund campaigns, when they can shape regulations through their influence, why would they allow change? So the crisis continues. The suicide rate stays high. The injuries keep happening. The farms keep closing. The corporations keep consolidating. The rural communities keep dying. And Americans keep eating food without understanding the human cost of getting it to their tables. The highway takes you away from farm country, back toward the cities where most people live, where the problems of agriculture seem distant and abstract. But they're not abstract to the farmer contemplating suicide. They're not abstract to the worker who just lost 3 fingers. They're not abstract to the family forced to sell the land that's been in their family for 5 generations. These aren't statistics. They're people. Real people, with names and families and dreams that are being crushed by a system that values profit over everything else. The next time you drive through farm country, remember that. Remember that the beautiful fields hide some ugly truths. Remember that cheap food comes at a cost, and somebody is paying that cost. Remember that American agriculture is in crisis, and that crisis affects all of us. Because when farmers can't make a living, when workers are exploited, when the land is degraded, when corporations control everything, the entire food system becomes fragile. We're all dependent on agriculture. We all need to eat. And the system that feeds us is breaking down. That's the dark truth about American farming. 100 facts, each one a thread in a larger story of exploitation, consolidation, and crisis. It's not the story we like to tell ourselves about farming, but it's the story that needs to be told. The sun is setting now. The fields turn golden again, then fade to shadow. The highway rolls on. And somewhere out there in the darkness, another farmer is lying awake, wondering how to make next month's payment. Another worker is nursing injuries that will never fully heal. Another family is making the agonizing decision to sell the farm. This is American agriculture in the 21st century. This is the reality behind the romantic image. This is what happens when we treat food production as just another industry to be optimized for profit. When we forget that farming is about more than efficiency and scale. When we let corporations control the system that feeds us all. We can do better, we have to do better. The question is whether we will. Until then, the crisis continues. The debt grows, the suicides mount, the injuries accumulate, the corporations consolidate, and the American highway stretches on through farm country, past fields that look so peaceful in the fading light, hiding darkness in plain sight. If you've been listening to this journey down the highway, if these facts have troubled you, maybe that's good. Maybe discomfort is the first step toward change. Maybe awareness is the beginning of action. These stories need to be told. These truths need to be heard. The people who grow our food deserve better. The land deserves better. We all deserve a food system that values people over profit, sustainability over scale, fairness over corporate control. That's the end of this particular stretch of highway. But the road goes on. Tomorrow you'll drive past more fields, more farms, more of the American landscape that feeds us all. And now you'll see it differently. You'll know what's really happening out there. Keep that knowledge with you. Share these stories. Ask questions about where your food comes from and who pays the real price for it. Support farmers who are trying to do things differently. Demand that your representatives take action on consolidation, on worker protection, on fair pricing. The crisis is real, the suffering is real, but so is the possibility of change. That's the message from the American highways, from the farm country you drive through, from the people whose stories we've shared. Remember them, remember what you've learned, and maybe, just maybe, use that knowledge to help build something better. The night settles over the fields, the stars come out, and somewhere tomorrow morning, the sun will rise on another day in American agriculture, with all its beauty and all its darkness, with all its promise and all its pain. This has been the story of 100 dark facts about American farming, the truths nobody wants to tell, the reality behind the rural American dream.